Guys, hi. Hope everybody's doing well. This little mini lesson is going to be a little bit longer because there's a lot of information in this one, and I have to give you a little background information before I can show you fractions to decimals. So I'm going to start with going back to place value, and you guys all have learned that we haven't done this side yet, but we all know that ones and then tens is to the left of that, then hundreds and thousands. So your numbers, whole numbers, are all of these places on the left-hand side of this decimal point. When we get to the decimal point, that is fractional parts of a whole. So just like a fraction is not a whole, one whole, decimals are just like fractions, not a whole. So if I was going to write a number, let's say I wrote let's do four wholes and 1/10 and 5/100. When I would read that or write that, I would say 4 and 1/10 or 15/100. So 4 and 15/100. Let's go back. If I'm looking at this, tenths, THS, and hundredths, you see that there's no ones. There is no ones place. So just like this side, you're going ones, tens, hundreds, you're going the same thing, tenths, hundredths, the next one would be thousandths, 10,000ths place, and so on. But in 4th grade, we only go up to hundredths. So your first spot, your first place value place after the decimal is tenths, and then the next one is hundredths. So if I am, let's say I wrote this number right here, this would be 17/100. If I have a 7 here, but nothing in the tenths place, I do have to hold my spot with a 0. So that means 7/100. If I don't have any hundredths, say my 7 is here in the tenths place, that's 7/10, which is actually the same amount. I'm not putting a 0 here, but the same amount. It's equal to 70/100. And I'll show you that here on the grid here in a minute. So last but not least, when we're doing this, if I have a number, I'm going to give you a hard one just to look at. We'll say 26, that's wholes, 26 wholes. When I look at the decimal point, I say and what do you think? 26, and I go over these two places. There's no tenths, but there are 900, so 26 and 900 would be an example. On the grids, we have grids for you because you will see some of these grids in your Google Classroom slides. Here's my tenths. You guys have all seen these charts with tenths and hundredths. This one is broken up into 10 pieces, and this one is broken up into 100. So let's say I wanted to show 2 tenths, so I'm going to shade in 2 of these tenths. As a fraction, you guys know that we write 2 over 10 as a fraction. If I was going to write that as a decimal, you have to think about it. Where's the tenths place? I'm saying 2 tenths, so as a decimal, I am going to say there are no wholes, so I'm going to put a 0 for my whole number. My decimal point shows that now I'm in my fractional or decimal part of a whole, and I have 2 tenths. So that first little place there is your tenths. That's where I'm going to put my 2. 2 tenths is how you write it as a decimal. These are the same thing. They equal the same amount. Fractions is one way to write it. Decimal is another way to write it. It's still the same amount. If I was going to do hundredths, I would show, let's see, I'll do because this one will be tricky. Let's say I do 7 of these boxes. So I now have 7 hundredths. So I'm going to put a 7 over 100 as a fraction. 7 hundredths. How would I write that as a decimal? Well, I have 0 holes. This whole thing is not shaded in, so I don't have any holes. There's my decimal point again, showing me my fractional or my decimal part. And then I count these up. There's 7 of them, but do I put it in the first place? No, because that's my 10th place, and I have to hold that spot. So I am going to put a 0 there to hold the spot, but then I put my 7 here because 7 is now in that hundredths place, tenths and then hundredths. So 7 hundredths looks like that as a decimal. So I hope that helps. The last part of our video here today, we're going to talk about converting decimals, which is a little bit of what I just did. But let's say I have a decimal or a fraction that says 67 over 100. How do you write that as a decimal? Well, again, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I have this hundredths grid, and I have 67 of them shaded in on my little place value where I have my whole number and then my decimals back here. Here's my tenths and here's my hundredths. If I have 67, it's going to go out to the hundredths place. So 67 hundredths, I have 0 holes and I have 67 hundredths. Let's say I have 5 hundredths. This is where kids get confused. If you have 5 hundredths, your 5 has to go in this hundredths place because this is where all the hundredths go. This place still needs to have a digit, so you still have to have a number there, and that's why we put in the 0. If I was going to go backwards, and I was going to, if I had 0, let's say 0 6/10, how would I write that as a fraction? Well, as I say it, 6/10. If I know that's a 6 and it's in the tenths place, I say it to myself, 6/10, I would write as a fraction 6/10. The other thing is, I know on one of the slides they're going to ask you to write it in word form, and the best way for me to do it is if I'm reading it to myself and thinking what I'm saying to myself, that's what I write down. So if I give you here's my number and I give you this number, that's my whole number, so I'm going to write 4 in words. 4. When I get to the decimal point, I write and means decimal point. That's what I put in place. 80. 1, and then hundredths. It goes out to the hundredths place, so I'm writing 100. And watch this, guys. You have to make sure that you add the THS, hundredths. That separates decimals from whole numbers. We're not in the hundreds place. We're in the hundredths place. So I think that takes